Hey guys, tonight we journey into a world of bowed heads, silent burdens, and the quiet desperation tucked beneath the surface of ancient rituals. It's feudal Japan, not the romantic version with cherry blossoms and noble warriors, but the raw, weathered one. A land where survival came with a price, and that price was often measured in rice, sweat, and silence. This isn't the tale of a shogun or a samurai in silk, but of a humble rice farmer named Yusuke, whose life was shaped not by war but by the weight of impossible taxes. Before we settle too deep into the night, if you're finding comfort in these sleepy corners of history, feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, but only if it truly feels right. I'd love to hear from you too. Drop a comment with your location and the time right now. It's strangely calming to see this little circle of listeners spread across time zones. Now's the moment to soften the lights, maybe let a gentle fan hum in the background, and allow your mind to rest as the story begins. It's the year 1617, and the village of Inami lies nestled between the dense cedar forests and low, mist-covered foothills of southern Japan. The land is damp from a night's rainfall, and the morning fog hangs thick and heavy, curling over the thatched rooftops like quiet ghosts returning from dreams. Yusuke is already awake, standing barefoot on the earthen floor of his hut, his breath curling faintly in the cool air. The walls around him are thin wood and woven reed, patched with straw where winter bit through the seams last year. His wife stirs behind the curtain of faded cloth that separates the single room into living and sleeping space. The coals in the fire pit are barely warm, and there's only enough dried sweet potato left to flavor the porridge. Outside, the first bell from the local shrine echoes across the fields, a soft, distant chime that marks the beginning of another day, not measured in hours or peace, but in how much rice can be coaxed from the soil, how many bundles can be harvested, and how much of it will be taken by the local magistrate's men. Taxes here are not paid with coins or silver. They are extracted in kind, bushels of rice, jars of pickled radish, and bundles of firewood. The village has no official charter, no protection, only the promise that if enough tribute is gathered and sent up the chain, to the daimyo, to the shogunate, then the soldiers will pass them by for another season. That is survival. As the sun stretches lazily behind the grey morning sky, Yusuke steps out into the muddy path that cuts through the village. His sandals, woven from straw, are already soggy and beginning to fray. Chickens cluck beside a broken fence, and the scent of damp wood smoke lingers in the air. Down the path, neighbours are beginning to appear, some with baskets, others pulling worn oxen behind them. There is no conversation, only nods. No one wants to speak too loudly before they've eaten, and no one wants to jinx the weather. Too much rain and the crops rot, too little and they die. The balance is as delicate as the string on a shamisen, always ready to snap. Today is no ordinary day, though. Today, the inspector is due. The tax officer, with his lacquered ledger and bamboo rod, will walk from house to house, counting sacks, peering into granaries, and weighing whether a family has withheld even a single grain. Punishment for cheating is swift. If a farmer hides rice, he risks not only his own hand, but his family's food ration for the season. Last year, a neighbor was beaten until he could no longer hold a sickle, accused of keeping back 5 handfuls of rice for his sick daughter. She died a week later. Everyone remembers, but no one speaks of it. And so Yusuke lifts his yoke and balances 2 wooden buckets across his shoulders. He moves toward the paddies, where the water is cold and the work is endless. Each step sinks slightly into the muddy path, and every splash echoes like a reminder that this land, for all its beauty, does not belong to him. He tills, he plants, he harvests, but the grain, most of it, travels far from this valley, feeding bellies he will never see. Still he works, because to stop would mean ruin, and because in feudal Japan, complaining about tax was a whisper of rebellion, and rebellion had its own price. The fields were quiet except for the gentle rustle of water sliding past the footpaths and the occasional caw of a distant crow that circled low over the cedar treetops. Yusuke worked alone, the skin on his fingers already puckered from hours of cold water. His hands disappeared again and again into the soft, feeling for stones, clearing the way for the delicate rice shoots that would be planted in tidy rows. It was a rhythm he had known since childhood, and yet it never became easy. There was something about the labor, its quiet relentlessness, that weighed heavier each year. He remembered when his father worked beside him, both of them bent at the waist like stalks of grain in the wind, sharing silent glances that meant more than words. Now his father was gone, buried beneath a small stone behind the family hut. His passing mourned briefly before the next planting season demanded Yusuke's full attention. Grief, after all, was a luxury best reserved for those with full bellies. He paused only briefly to straighten his aching spine, eyes drifting toward the small road that led to the edge of the village. No sign yet of the inspector. But it wasn't a matter of if. It was only a matter of when. The tax officer never missed his visit. His arrival always came with a creaking cart, the scratch of brushes on parchment, and the unbearable tension that gripped every household like frost gripping the edge of a thatched roof. The officer would appear with 2 assistants, their faces blank, eyes scanning every corner, every cupboard, every grain sack. No smile, no apology, no care for the hardship his presence stirred. He was not there to understand. He was there to count. Yusuke returned to his work, his shoulders tightening with each movement. The earth was generous when treated kindly, but it asked for everything. His legs, submerged to the shin in muddy water, throbbed with cold. The hem of his trousers clung to his skin like wet parchment. He thought briefly of his son, little Haruto, who had turned 7 in the spring. The boy had begged to help today, eager to prove himself. But Yusuke had sent him to the mountainside with the old auntie to gather kindling and herbs, knowing full well the tax officer might arrive while he was in the fields. Children had a way of asking questions at the wrong time, and Yusuke couldn't bear the idea of his son watching him bow and scrape before men who measured human worth by the weight of harvested rice. From across the waterlogged furrows, another farmer raised a hand in greeting. It was Genji, whose paddies bordered Yusuke's. He looked tired. More tired than usual. His second daughter had fallen ill during the last frost, and the family had been unable to spare enough rice to trade for medicine. She was better now, but not well, her cheeks still pale, her cough still lingering. Genji had already lost 1 child the year before, a boy just 5 years old, taken not by illness, but by a landslide that swept through the far end of the village after days of heavy rain. That same storm had washed away half of Genji's early crop, and yet the tax demand came unchanged. Illness, loss, weather, it did not matter. The quota was fixed, and the penalties for falling short were not negotiable. As the sun climbed behind the thick clouds, warming the morning slightly, Yusuke crouched again and continued planting. His fingers were numb, but he welcomed it. Numbness was better than the sharp ache of fear. That fear, always waiting, always circling. It had lived with him since he had first taken over the paddy from his father. Not the fear of war or bandits, those were distant worries, but the fear of debt, of owing, of being seen as a man who could not meet his obligations. In this village, in this time, failing to meet the tribute wasn't just shameful, it was dangerous. The magistrate's men did not break kneecaps. They broke families. A house could be stripped, tools confiscated, a wife taken into labor for the magistrate's estate until the shortfall was made good. Children, too, sometimes taken as servants if the family had no other assets. It was legal, it was policy, and it was accepted. That was perhaps the worst part, not that it happened, but that everyone understood it as the natural order of things. A quiet splash behind him made Yusuke turn, startled, but it was only a heron lifting itself from the reeds, wings brushing the mist as it vanished into the trees. Still his heart beat faster, the smallest sounds seemed louder today. The air itself felt dense, full of something unseen. He knew what it was. The collective breath of a village waiting to be measured, judged, and almost certainly found wanting. He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, smearing mud across his temple, and looked once more toward the road. It would not be long now. The price of survival, he knew, would be tallied in full by nightfall. The cart was heard before it was seen. The faint wooden creak of wheels turning over uneven earth drifted into the fields like the opening line of a grim song, one that every farmer knew by heart but dreaded all the same. Yusuke did not look up right away. He focused on the last section of his row, planting the tender green shoots as evenly as his fingers would allow, even though the lines would be examined later by men who did not care about the precision. They cared only about output, about bushels, about what would be boxed and recorded and loaded onto ox-drawn wagons bound for the granaries owned by men who never touched soil. The sound grew closer. A rhythmic crunch of footsteps accompanied it now, a pair of sandals slapping mud, deliberate and clean. Yusuke finally stood and wiped his hands on the cloth tied around his waist. He did not straighten fully, not yet. It would be unwise to appear idle. The appearance of work, of urgency, mattered. It suggested respect. It suggested a man who understood his place and was grateful for the order imposed upon his world, even if it came at a cost. He turned slightly toward the narrow path that bordered the rice paddy. There they were, 3 figures walking behind the cart. The inspector, in his dark robe, the family crest of his employer, stitched just beneath the collar, and 2 younger men beside him, each carrying a wooden tablet and brush. The inspector was not from the village. He had never been. His face was narrow, his eyes perpetually squinting, as if everything he saw was somehow beneath him. He wore his authority like armor, stiff and lacquered. He stopped at the edge of the paddy, brushing a smudge from his sleeve with slow, practiced fingers, then looked directly at Yusuke without speaking. That was always how it began. Silence, an examination. Not of the field, but of the farmer, the way he stood, the way he bowed, the way his voice trembled when he finally offered the expected greeting. Yusuke bowed low, his hands sliding to the sides of his knees, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Welcome, honored officer. May the gods watch over your journey today." The words were practiced, shaped by repetition. The same words his father had spoken, the same ones he had heard pass from the lips of every other man in the village. They held no meaning anymore, not really. But meaning wasn't the point, ritual was. The proper phrases, the proper posture, the correct sequence of submission. The tax was not simply extracted from the body, it was extracted from the spirit. The inspector sniffed slightly and stepped closer, peering down at the shallow, water-filled rows. Rows he did not compliment the planting. He did not acknowledge the back-breaking hours Yusuke had spent bending beneath the cold sky. He only nodded toward one of his assistants, who immediately crouched and began making marks on the waxed tablet he carried. "The storage shed," the inspector said, his voice thin and bored. "We will begin there." Yusuke bowed again, deeper this time, and stepped out of the paddy, his feet squelching in the mud. He led them along the narrow path that wound between neighboring fields, each one lined with anxious eyes, pretending not to stare. No one spoke, not openly, but their silence carried the weight of prayers, whispered only in the privacy of night, or during brief moments alone in the forest when no one could overhear. Prayers that the quotas would be reasonable this year, that the measuring sticks used to weigh the rice would not be shaved too thin, that the officials would not find fault where there was only honesty. The shed was a simple structure, no bigger than the main room of his home, built from timber salvaged from a collapsed bridge 2 winters ago. Its roof sagged slightly, and a bird had nested near the top beam, but it was dry inside and secure. Yusuke opened the door slowly, letting the smell of dry grain and old wood seep out into the air. Inside, neatly arranged in bundles, were the sacks of rice he had saved for the tax. He had counted them 12 times, checked the cords, smoothed the canvas. Still, he knew it might not be enough. The inspector stepped inside without waiting and motioned for the assistants to begin. They moved quickly, kneeling beside the sacks, pulling them open, plunging their hands into the rice, lifting small handfuls and letting the grains fall between their fingers as if the truth could be found in the sound. They made notes. Occasionally they whispered to each other. Yusuke stood in the doorway, hands clasped, shoulders tight. His mouth was dry, every moment stretched longer than it should. Each gesture felt like judgment. Finally, the inspector turned to him. "This is less than last year." Yusuke bowed again. "The early frost killed part of the second planting, Honorable Sir. I planted again, but the yield was not strong." The inspector did not nod. He did not frown. He simply turned away. "We will return before sundown to weigh the remaining stores. Be prepared." Then, without further comment, he stepped back into the light, his sandals tapping against the packed earth as he walked toward the next house. His assistants followed, their tablets already filling with numbers and remarks. Yusuke remained still for a long moment. The shed was quiet again, the sacks untouched, but he knew that peace was temporary. A number had been entered beside his name, and that number would decide everything. Whether his family would eat full bowls this winter, whether his tools would remain in his hands or be taken in the night as penalty, whether Haruto would be allowed to stay home or sent to carry buckets for a wealthier man's kitchen. The sun was higher now, the clouds thinning, but the weight in Yusuke's chest was heavier than it had been at dawn. The moment the tax officer's cart disappeared from view, swallowed by the bend in the path and the whispering green of the bamboo thickets beyond, the village seemed to exhale. Not loudly, not with relief exactly, but with the cautious breath of those who know that danger has merely stepped around the corner and not truly gone. Yusuke stood outside the storage shed for a while longer, his hand resting lightly against the weather-worn wood, as though the contact might ground him. He could still feel the imprint of their presence in the air, the lingering scrutiny, like a dampness that refused to lift. The inspector's comment echoed quietly in his mind. This is less than last year, a simple phrase, spoken without cruelty, without anger, but heavy enough to alter the shape of a season. He walked slowly back to the house, dragging one of the empty buckets with him to give his hands something to do. The sky above had cleared somewhat, the clouds drifting eastward toward the mountains, leaving behind a washed-out blue and a faint scent of warming earth. Spring had finally settled in. The plum trees were beginning to bloom near the old shrine, and in any other year, Yusuke might have paused to admire them, or at least noted them in passing, as a quiet promise that the coldest days had truly passed. But this year the blossoms looked delicate and distant, like decorations for someone else's peace. At the door to his home, he hesitated, listening. The soft clatter of cooking pots came from within, along with the muffled hum of his wife's voice as she sang to their younger daughter while preparing the noon meal. He stepped inside and let the warmth of the charcoal hearth soothe the chill that still clung to his sleeves. His wife, Kaori, glanced up and offered a brief smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. She didn't ask about the inspection. She didn't need to. They had lived together long enough to read each other's silences, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the dulled set of his mouth. Haruto returned not long after, his cheeks flushed from the mountain air, his hands full of kindling and tiny white mushrooms still speckled with dirt. He was talking as he walked, chattering about a fox he thought he had seen near the ridge, and how Auntie said it was probably just a trick of the morning mist. Yusuke listened with half an ear, grateful for the sound of his son's voice, the unfiltered lightness of it. Childhood, after all, was a season just as fleeting as any other, and in their world it ended early. The meal was simple, rice from the lesser sack, the one they kept hidden from the tax officials, seasoned with a pinch of dried seaweed and a splash of miso if they could spare it. A bit of pickled radish on the side, thinned with water to stretch it across more bowls. They ate slowly, deliberately, chewing more for the rhythm than the satisfaction. Conversation was light, fragmented. Haruto spoke the most. Yusuke offered small responses, careful to sound attentive. Kaori said little, though she watched them both with a gaze that held more weight than any words could. After the meal, while Haruto and his sister played outside with sticks in the dust, Yusuke and Kaori sat near the fire. He told her what the inspector had said, keeping his voice low though there was no one nearby to overhear. She nodded slowly, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. "We can spare a little more," she said at last. "I can trade the extra cloth I wove with Aya for another jar of millet. Maybe that will free up some of the rice." Yusuke didn't answer immediately. He stared at the dying embers and listened to the wind outside, stirring the thatch above their heads. Every year they offered a little more. Every year it still somehow fell short. There were no lies in their offerings, only the truth of scarcity. And yet the system treated them as though failure was a choice, not a condition of the very soil they farmed. "I don't want to trade with Aya again," he said finally. "Her husband's in trouble. He was accused of hiding seed grain." Kaori looked up quickly, her face tightening. "Is it true?" He shook his head. "I don't think so, but truth doesn't matter if someone else whispers loud enough." She closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. "I'll find someone else." They sat in silence for a while after that. The fire snapped softly, the kindling crackling like bones underfoot. Outside, the children laughed, their voices weaving through the quiet like wind chimes on a still day. Yusuke tried to hold on to that sound, to let it ease the knot in his chest, but he knew what was coming. The inspector would return by dusk, and with him a verdict, not of guilt or innocence, but of sufficiency, of whether a man had given enough, and whether the numbers scribbled on waxed tablets matched the expectations of men who had never once bent their backs to pull rice from the mud. He would return, and Yusuke would be waiting, not with hope, but with what he had left. The late afternoon light slanted across the village like golden threads unwinding from the sky. It brushed the tops of thatched roofs and shimmered on the still surface of the irrigation channels, lending a temporary softness to a place otherwise bound in strain. The sound of children had faded with the passing hours, their play replaced by quiet tasks and hushed instructions as every household prepared for the return of the inspector. Chickens were ushered into coops, laundry pulled from lines, the smoke from hearths turned low to avoid appearing wasteful. It was not just about rice and numbers, it was about presentation, about seeming modest, obedient, unthreatening, the way a rabbit sits still in the underbrush when it hears footsteps, hoping to disappear into stillness. Inside Yusuke's home, the atmosphere was calm on the surface but taut beneath. Kaori had prepared tea, the weak kind made from browned rice and dried leaves, and set it carefully on the small wooden tray near the entrance. Haruto sat on his knees, unusually quiet now, sensing the shift in the air. His sister lay curled in the corner, her head resting on a woven mat, her breath slow and steady in sleep. Yusuke checked the sacks once more, lifting them slightly to feel their weight, smoothing their edges. They were arranged with care, like offerings at a shrine, even though they might not be enough. When the inspector returned, it was with the same deliberate rhythm, the creak of the cartwheels marking time, like a drumbeat in the stillness. The assistants trailed behind him, faces unreadable, brushes already in hand. They did not knock. They never did. They entered as if by right, their sandals left at the threshold, their presence unannounced but entirely expected. Yusuke bowed deeply, his forehead nearly brushing the floor. Kaori followed, her hands pressed together, her eyes downcast. Haruto tried to mimic his father's bow, awkward and a little too fast, but sincere in its effort. The inspector didn't acknowledge him. The main inspection was swift. The assistant lifted the lid on each sack, jotted a note, moved to the next. One tapped the side of a jar, listening for hollowness. Another opened the storage chest near the hearth and rifled through the spare rags, lifting them with the tip of his brush as if dirt might cling to the bristles. They said little. They rarely did. It was all written down, calculated later, in a quiet room where the villagers had no voice, no presence, only numbers beside their names. Then the inspector turned to Yusuke and spoke, his voice as smooth as it was indifferent. "You are short by 2 measures." Yusuke's head lowered again. "The harvest was poor this season, Honorable Sir. I will work longer hours. Perhaps I can trade for the shortfall." The inspector's lips twitched, not quite a frown. "This is your 3rd year falling short." Yusuke didn't answer right away. There was no safe answer to that. It was the truth. The margins had tightened each year. The weather had turned. One year there had been a fungus in the soil that withered an entire row. Another year, flooding. And yet the quota did not bend with the elements. It remained fixed, a demand unmoored from the reality of the land. "I will send my son to work at the storehouse," Yusuke said at last, "until we make up the difference." Kaori flinched slightly beside him, but she did not speak. The inspector studied the boy for a moment, then turned back to his assistants. A few quiet murmurs passed between them, followed by more scratching of brush against wood. Then he nodded. "Very well, he reports at dawn. See that he is clean." The men left without further words, their robes trailing behind them as they disappeared into the soft light of early evening. The door slid shut behind them with a dull wooden click that sounded to Yusuke like the closing of a gate. Inside, the silence that followed was not peaceful. Kaori stood slowly, walked toward the hearth and adjusted the kettle, even though the water inside had long gone cold. Her hands trembled slightly, the movement so small it might have been missed if Yusuke hadn't been watching. Haruto said nothing. He stared at the floor, his brow furrowed, not entirely understanding but sensing something had changed. Something had been decided without his voice, without his consent. Yusuke knelt beside him and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "It will be only for a short time," he said quietly. "Just until the quota is met." Haruto nodded, but his voice, when it came, was small. "Will I be allowed to come home at night?" Yusuke hesitated. "I don't know yet." Outside, the sky had begun to dim, the golden light turning grey. The plum blossoms swayed gently in the wind, their petals beginning to fall, soft and silent, unnoticed. The morning that followed came with the kind of quiet that felt different from ordinary silence. It wasn't the gentle stillness of sleep or the hush of a calm day, but the kind that lingered between people when something had been agreed upon that no one wanted to speak of. Yusuke rose before the sun, his body aching from the field work and the weight of choices that still pressed heavy on his chest. He did not wake Haruto right away. Instead, he stepped outside and let the cool air wash over him as he sat on the small, wooden stoop beside the door. The sky was still dark, but there was a thin silver line at the edge of the horizon, and soon enough it would grow into the light of another long day. He reached for the rice straw broom leaning against the house and began sweeping the earth in front of the doorway, not because it needed it, but because his hands wanted something to do. When Kaori joined him, she said nothing at first. She carried with her a bundle of cloth and a small bowl filled with water warmed over the fire. She sat beside Yusuke and began to carefully scrub Haruto's work clothes. They were simple, worn garments, but she treated them with great care, smoothing the fibers between her fingers, washing each patch and seam like it mattered. As though some part of her believed that if her son looked respectful enough, presentable enough, they might not work him too hard. Or maybe she knew they would, but couldn't bear to let him leave looking as if no one cared. It was a small act, this washing, but it was filled with a kind of defiant tenderness that Yusuke could hardly bring himself to interrupt. When the time came, Haruto was already awake. He had dressed himself and stood just inside the door, fidgeting with the ties of his tunic. His eyes were wide, too wide for his small face, and his lips were pressed together in a line that quivered once or twice but didn't break. Yusuke gave him a nod, then walked over and crouched to adjust the knot on the boy's belt. "Don't talk too much," he said gently. "Keep your eyes low, work hard, listen well. They don't expect smiles, just effort." Haruto nodded, his voice caught somewhere between his heart and his throat. Kaori came to him and wrapped the extra cloth bundle for his midday meal, tying it tight and placing it into his hands. Then she leaned down and pressed her forehead to his. It was not a goodbye. It was a kind of blessing. The walk to the village storehouse was not long, but every step felt like part of a procession. Other villagers passed them on the way to their fields, some giving small nods, others turning their eyes away. Everyone knew, everyone understood, but no one spoke. At the gates of the storehouse, the inspector's assistant waited, brush in hand, a tablet tucked into his belt. He said little beyond a nod of acknowledgement, then motioned for Haruto to follow. The boy looked once over his shoulder, his eyes locking with his father's for a heartbeat longer than usual. Then he turned and disappeared behind the gate. Yusuke stood there for a moment longer. His feet didn't want to move. His chest felt hollow, like something essential had been taken from him and stored away with the grain. He turned and began the walk back, the soft crunch of gravel beneath his feet muffled by the heaviness of his thoughts. The fields would not wait for grief, and the work was already late. By the time he reached his paddy, the sun had broken fully over the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. He stepped into the rows and began again, each movement now somehow slower, the ache in his back more pronounced. The day passed with the weight of absence. Kaori said little, moving about the home with a kind of mechanical precision, pausing only now and then to glance out the doorway as though half expecting Haruto to come skipping down the path. When the sun dipped low again, Yusuke returned from the fields with mud-caked legs and aching shoulders. He washed quickly, ate without appetite, and sat long into the evening, staring at the fire. Haruto did not return that night. At the storehouse, the boy had been set to sweeping at first, then to hauling small crates. His hands blistered quickly, unused to the coarse rope and rough wood. But he said nothing, working in silence beside other boys from other homes, all wearing the same worn expressions. At dusk, they were given thin rice gruel and a mat on the floor to sleep. The room smelled of sweat and dust, and the boys slept lined up like supplies, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their dreams flickering like candlelight, fragile and often interrupted. Back at home, the fire crackled low, and Yusuke lay awake on the woven mat beside Kaori. Neither spoke. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, rustling the leaves with a whisper that might have been a voice if one was desperate enough to believe it. In the stillness of that night, as shadows stretched across the floor and the sky beyond the window turned a deep, impenetrable blue, a single truth wrapped itself around the household like the chill in the air. Even when no one comes to take it, survival still collects its tax. The next few days passed in a rhythm that felt strangely hollow, like a song with every other note missing. Yusuke went about his work with the same steadiness he always had, rising before the light and returning when the sky turned the soft pink of early evening, but there was something missing in every movement. The house was quieter without Haruto, and even Kaori's tasks, stoking the fire, preparing the rice, checking the roof for loose reeds, carried with them an extra stillness. The little girl asked once when her brother would be back. Kaori told her he was helping the village for a little while, that he was being very brave. Then she looked down at her stitching and didn't speak for the rest of the hour. Yusuke, sitting on the porch later that evening, tried not to think of the small space near the hearth where Haruto used to sit with his knees tucked to his chest, nibbling on boiled roots and whispering stories to himself like he was narrating dreams aloud. The weather had shifted. It was warmer now. The frost was finally gone from the early morning grass, and tiny green buds were beginning to show along the edges of the paths. One would think such signs would be a comfort, but in villages like theirs, warmth only meant new worries. Rainstorms became more unpredictable, pests would start to return, and with every week that passed, the planting season drew closer to its midpoint, leaving no room for delay. Yusuke pushed harder in the fields, the muscles in his arms aching in that familiar way that never entirely left. He worked from memory now, hardly noticing the chill of the muddy water or the sting in his knees from kneeling too long. The body becomes used to pain, he had learned, just as the spirit grows used to silence. At the storehouse, Haruto's days unfolded in a pattern not so different from his father's. Rise early, work until the sky darkened, sleep in a row. He learned quickly how to scrub the stone floors with water from the well, how to carry heavy baskets balanced across his shoulders like the older boys, how to listen without speaking and move when spoken to. There were no cruel beatings, no shouted commands, but there was no kindness either. The men in charge issued orders as though issuing receipts. The boys were tools, replaceable and functional. Occasionally one was sent home early due to fever or injury. The others never asked what happened after. It was understood that asking led nowhere. So Haruto kept his eyes low and his hands busy, repeating his father's advice each morning like a quiet prayer in his chest. Work hard, listen well, don't speak unless asked. It was in the small moments, however, that the ache of home found its way through. At night, lying on his mat, Haruto would stare at the wooden beams above and count the knots in the wood, just as he used to count stars through the hole in the thatched roof back home. He missed the way his mother's voice sounded when she hummed while cooking. He missed the warmth of the hearth fire at his feet, the feeling of his little sister falling asleep beside him with one hand curled in his sleeve. Even the itch of the straw mat at home felt different than this one. Softer, more his. Back in the village, Kaori had begun walking each morning to the edge of the path that led toward the storehouse. She never went all the way. That would have drawn attention, and besides, she had chores to finish. But she stood for a few minutes each day under the same tree, watching the horizon as if she might catch a glimpse of her son returning early. She never did. Still, she returned to the same spot, day after day, hands tucked into her sleeves, eyes squinting against the light. Yusuke noticed, of course. He never mentioned it. It would have served no purpose. Instead, he worked later in the fields, finding reasons to repair the fence, clean the tools again, check the irrigation channels for blockages that weren't really there. He stayed busy so he wouldn't have to sit with his thoughts too long, because those thoughts always circled back to the same truth. He had offered his son in place of rice. And even if it was common, even if it was understood by everyone in the village as a necessary thing, it still didn't sit right in his heart. Sacrifice was expected, but knowing that didn't make it easier to bear. On the 5th day, the inspector returned. Not with his full retinue, not with the noise of inspection, but quietly, walking alone with a letter tucked into his robe. He handed it to Yusuke without ceremony, merely stating that the shortfall had been noted and that the village's contribution was accepted, but further leniency would not be granted next season. There was a pause, one that seemed almost human, before the inspector added that the boy was working well. Then he left, his sandals crunching softly against the gravel. Yusuke held the letter long after the man had gone, even though there was nothing written in it that he didn't already know. It was thin and impersonal, stamped with ink that was barely dry. But it meant something. Not approval, not forgiveness, just survival. Bought once again at a cost. The days after the letter arrived slipped by with a gentler rhythm, though it was more an illusion than a change in fortune. The fields still demanded every drop of sweat Yusuke had to offer. The quotas hadn't lessened. The uncertainty still lingered like mist on the hills, but the immediate threat had stepped back just far enough to let the villagers breathe again. Or perhaps it was simply that the mind could only hold so much dread before it learned to set it aside for the sake of survival. People returned to their routines, cautious glances gave way to murmured greetings, and the children, those still at home, resumed their games with a little more freedom. But for Yusuke and Kaori, each dawn began with an unspoken question. Would today bring any word from Haruto? It wasn't unusual for children to serve short terms at the storehouse during tax season. Most returned within a fortnight, sometimes with a coin or a small parcel of dried goods in return for their labor, more often with just their tired limbs and the quiet look of someone who had glimpsed the colder edges of the world. But Haruto's absence lingered longer than expected. When the 14th day came and went without his return, Kaori's movements became more clipped. Her voice, always soft, now carried a tremble at its edges that even she didn't seem to notice. At night, she lay awake longer than Yusuke, her eyes open to the dark, listening to the wind brush against the walls and the distant calls of nightbirds. Yusuke tried not to let worry root too deep. The inspector had said the boy was working well. That had to mean something. It was possible he'd been chosen for a longer assignment, perhaps to assist with the spring inventory, or to help prepare stores for shipment to the regional capital. These were things that happened. Logical, explainable. But logic didn't fill the space where Haruto's voice used to echo. It didn't warm the spot beside the hearth that now lay undisturbed each evening. And so Yusuke buried himself further in his labor, tending not just to his own field, but offering quiet help to Genji and 2 of the elder farmers when they fell behind due to illness or tools breaking. He said little, accepted no payment, but each time he felt a little less powerless. Doing something, anything, was better than standing still in the current. It was on the 18th day that word finally arrived. Not through official channels, not in a scroll or seal, but through an old man named Ikuzo who had traveled into the nearby town to barter firewood and returned with word that a shipment of grain was delayed at the river port. Among those assisting with the loading, he had seen a boy matching Haruto's description, sleeves rolled up, directing younger children and lifting sacks half his size with a surprising steadiness. Looked strong, Ikuzo had said, nodding as he chewed on a sliver of dried persimmon. Didn't say much, but he's got his father's stance, doesn't slouch. The relief that passed over Yusuke was quiet, almost imperceptible. He didn't rush to embrace Kaori or cry out in joy. He simply sat down by the fire that night and let his shoulders drop for the first time in days. Kaori, standing by the kettle, kept her hands busy, but her eyes shimmered just a little brighter when she next stirred the pot. Their son was alive. He was working, and from the sound of it, he was enduring. In their world, that was what counted most. That night, after their daughter had fallen asleep and the fire burned low, Yusuke spoke softly. "When he comes home," he said, "not using if, but when, we'll let him rest. He'll sleep in. I'll take his share of the field work for a while, and we'll cook something special. Maybe the dried eel my cousin sent last year." Kaori nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "And we'll give him the cloth I was saving for his festival robe," she added. "He's outgrown the old one anyway." There was a long silence after that. Not uncomfortable, just full. Then Kaori reached out and touched Yusuke's arm, a light touch, barely a press of her fingers, but enough to say what neither had put into words yet. That they missed him. That they worried more than they let on. That they were proud. And that they hoped with the soft, stubborn hope that keeps people going through lean winters and harder springs. Outside, the moon had risen, casting pale silver across the rooftops and bathing the narrow paths in quiet light. In the stillness, as sleep began to weigh gently on their limbs, there was something else too, not certainty, but the smallest breath of peace. The sun rose soft and orange on the 19th day, casting long golden shadows over the village rooftops and brushing the tips of the paddies with warmth that felt almost gentle. Yusuke was already awake, though he hadn't slept much the night before. Sleep came in fragments now, drifting in and out like mist through bamboo. But this morning felt different. The The breeze was lighter, the air less tense. It might have been the quiet relief that came after hearing Ikuzo's report. Or perhaps it was simply the shift of the season finally settling into place. In either case, Yusuke moved with more ease than he had in weeks, not because the labor had grown easier, but because hope had taken root again in the background of his thoughts. He stepped into the paddy just as the morning dew began to lift, the water cool and clear around his ankles, and resumed the rhythmic planting that defined so much of his life. With each shoot he set into the mud, he thought of Haruto's hands, small, strong, probably blistered now, and wondered if the boy had learned the same rhythm while carrying crates by the river. Work teaches you things no lecture ever could. It teaches you where pain begins and how far it can go before it changes shape. It teaches you how silence can stretch between people without breaking them, and how every task, no matter how small, is a thread in the cloth of endurance. Later that morning, Kaori returned from the communal well with water sloshing quietly in her buckets, her back a little straighter than usual. The other women had begun asking gentle questions again, the kind meant not to pry, but to affirm. Had there been more word? Was he well? Would he be returning soon? Kaori answered as plainly as she could, offering only what she knew for certain. Yes, someone had seen him. Yes, he was strong. Yes, they believed he would be home before the month turned. That last part she added more from desire than knowledge, but no one questioned her. They all understood that sometimes the belief in a thing was just as necessary as the thing itself. That evening, as twilight spread its lavender hues across the hills, Yusuke came home to find a small parcel wrapped in coarse cloth waiting just inside the doorway. Kaori looked at him with a mix of curiosity and concern. It hadn't been there when she left to check on the neighbor's firewood supply. It bore no mark of official delivery, no name, just a simple knot tied with care. Yusuke crouched and unwrapped it slowly. Inside, nestled among straw, were a few dried persimmons, 2 sweet rice cakes wrapped in mulberry leaves, and a folded scrap of paper with a short message in a handwriting they both recognized. The words were uneven, the brush strokes shaky, but the effort behind them was unmistakable. It simply read, "I saw the river fish jump today." It reminded me of when we watched them in spring. "I'm eating well. I'll be home soon. Tell Mother not to worry. And please don't finish all the pickles." Yusuke stared at the note for a long time, then read it aloud slowly so Kaori could hear it in full. She didn't cry, but her eyes softened in that way that happens just before tears gather. She pressed her hand against her chest, then turned toward the fire without speaking, as if the note had lit something inside her that needed tending. They divided one rice cake and saved the other. It felt like a ritual, sharing that small sweetness together, sitting near the fire as the night pressed gently against the house. The pickles Haruto mentioned were a family joke. He had once hidden the jar in a basket of onions so his little sister wouldn't eat all the sour plums during New Year. Yusuke chuckled quietly as he remembered it, the sound barely more than a breath. In that moment, the house felt fuller than it had in days. When they finally turned in for the night, the woven mats beneath them felt softer. The wind outside didn't seem as cold, and the distance between father and son, while still measured in miles and days, no longer felt like an endless stretch of silence. It was now a thread tugged gently by laughter, by scribbled words on rough paper, by the knowledge that the boy was still out there, still himself. Yusuke closed his eyes that night with the image of Haruto, standing by the river, pointing at leaping fish, eyes wide with the same quiet wonder he used to have when watching stars through the cracks in their roof. and for the first time in many nights, sleep came swiftly and stayed. The days that followed were some of the mildest the village had seen all season. The winds softened, carrying with them the scent of fresh shoots and the faint sweetness of distant blossoms. In the early morning, a mist still curled low over the paddies, wrapping the earth in a quiet that felt like a pause between chapters. And though there was no way to mark it precisely, both Yusuke and Kaori felt something shifting in their bones, a small tug at the threads of routine that hinted that their son's return was drawing near. Each morning, Kaori rose a little earlier to prepare 2 extra scoops of rice, just in case Haruto came home before breakfast. She knew it was unlikely, but the simple act of preparing a meal for him gave her a sense of closeness that no letter could match. The bowls sat waiting each day, untouched, their steam curling into the rafters like small prayers. And each day, when evening came and Haruto's place remained empty, Kaori would quietly transfer the rice into the pot to save it for the next meal. Nothing was wasted in their home, not food, not effort, not love. Yusuke, for his part, had begun to work with a renewed clarity. Not that the burden had lessened, there were always more tasks than hours, but now his thoughts were tethered to something more than worry. He imagined the stories Haruto might bring back. Perhaps he had seen the market district at the edge of the port town, or watched the boats arrive heavy with crates of dried fish and silk. Maybe he had even spoken with a merchant from another province. The idea of his son encountering such things felt strange and stirring. Yusuke himself had never traveled far beyond their region, his life hemmed in by the needs of the land and the demands of tribute. But Haruto had stepped outside that pattern, even if only slightly. And that, in its own quiet way, was something like a miracle. The letter had changed things in the village too. When neighbors heard of it, some through Kaori's soft mention, others through the subtle grapevine of shared chores and exchanged baskets, the mood shifted. There was still hardship, yes. A late frost had touched one corner of Genji's field, and old Haruna had lost a chicken to a fox. But there was also a little more laughter around the well, a few more shared jokes during the walk to the hillside shrine. People began to remember that hope was not just for fools or the wealthy. It belonged to them too, however briefly. Then, on the 24th morning, since Haruto had been sent away, Yusuke awoke to the sound of footsteps on the path outside their home. Not heavy like the inspector's men, not hurried like a messenger, but steady and deliberate. He sat up quickly, heart thudding. Kaori was already halfway to the door, her hands trembling as she slid it open. There he stood. Haruto was dusty, and his tunic was wrinkled in ways that spoke of long hours and short rest, but he was taller somehow, and his eyes had changed, not hardened, but deeper, more observant. He carried a bundle slung over one shoulder, and in his other hand, a small sack of dried beans, and 2 chipped coins nestled in his palm. Kaori gasped softly and pulled him into her arms, holding him so tightly that Haruto laughed a little, though it cracked with emotion. Yusuke came to them then, resting a hand on his son's head and keeping it there for a long moment, as though making sure the boy was real and not just another thought dreamed into the quiet night. They brought him inside, sat him near the fire, and poured water over his hands to wash the journey away. Kaori unwrapped the food she had been saving, small pickled plums, a few slices of radish, and the second rice cake from the parcel. Haruto ate slowly at first, but then hunger overtook formality, and soon he was finishing every bite with the enthusiasm only a child can bring. He spoke between mouthfuls, telling stories of the boats he had seen and the storehouse records he had helped carry. He described the other boys, how some had fought, others had cried, and a few had taken to singing old temple songs at night just to chase the silence away. But when the food was gone and his voice grew softer, he leaned into his father's shoulder and spoke quietly about how he had missed them. About the night he had nearly fallen asleep standing, and the morning the river mist had looked so much like home that he'd cried behind a crate so no one would see. Yusuke listened, his heart a knot of pride and sorrow. He had sent his son into the world too soon, out of necessity, out of desperation. But the boy had returned not just intact, but larger in spirit. That night, they laid out fresh mats and Kaori brought the festival cloth she had promised. Haruto changed into it shyly, marveling at how it no longer fit like it once had. And when they all lay down together in the flickering light of the fire, it was as though time paused, letting them exist in that perfect stillness a moment longer. Outside, the moon rose behind the cedar trees, bright and full, and for the first time in weeks, the house breathed easy. The next morning rose with a brightness that seemed to stretch beyond the sun itself. The village stirred slowly under its soft light, smoke curling lazily from rooftops, roosters offering half-hearted calls as if they too sensed that something in the rhythm of things had shifted. Inside Yusuke's home, the air felt warmer, not from the hearth alone, but from the simple presence of wholeness. The low hum of morning was no longer dulled by absence. Haruto was back, his breathing joining theirs in sleep, his small frame curled beside the fire, as though he'd never left at all. Yusuke was the first to rise. He sat quietly for a while, watching the silhouettes of his family sleeping under the woven mats, the soft rustling of Kaori's breath, and the light snore from Haruto, as his leg kicked out once, then stilled again. The moment was brief, but complete. He did not want to wake them. Yet the work was waiting, as it always did, and so he moved softly, stepping out into the morning where the dew had begun to retreat, into the thirsty soil. As he bent to check the paddy's edge, tracing the water flow with calloused fingers, his mind wandered. He thought not of taxes or quotas or even the inspector's inevitable return, but of Haruto's eyes as he had spoken the night before. They had changed. There was something older in them now, some small weight pressed gently behind the brightness. Yusuke had seen it before in men who had walked through hunger, in widows who carried grief without complaint. Haruto had joined them now, not through loss, but through endurance. It pained him to know it had happened so soon, but a part of him also felt pride, tangled as it was in sorrow. By the time Yusuke returned to the house, Haruto was awake, sitting cross-legged by the fire and chewing thoughtfully on a leftover bit of millet cake. Kaori hovered nearby, adjusting his robe and fussing with his hair, her movements brisk and full of affection she had no words for. Haruto took it with quiet amusement, not resisting, letting her hands move around him like she was trying to stitch the pieces of him back together with touch alone. His sister, still groggy from sleep, clung to his sleeve and refused to let go for several minutes, her thumb tucked in her mouth as she blinked up at him with the absolute devotion only a younger sibling can possess. The family spent that morning together for the first time in weeks, without haste. Yusuke delayed his trip to the fields and Kaori skipped her walk to the well. Instead, they sat beneath the awning just outside their door, watching the light shift across the path and listening to the sounds of the village easing into the day. Haruto shared more stories, this time lighter ones. He spoke of a dog that wandered the port and always managed to steal food from the grain carts, and how the storehouse master finally gave up chasing it and left a bowl of scraps near the gate. He mimicked the man's walk, the way he tilted his head and huffed when angry, and Kaori laughed, the sound small but real, like something forgotten, but suddenly remembered again. Eventually, the day pulled them back into its pattern. The water still needed to be drawn. The weeds would not wait, but the hours felt easier. Even work held a softness that had been missing. Haruto followed Yusuke into the paddy, not out of duty, but out of a desire to reconnect with the land that had once shaped his every day. He crouched low, imitating his father's movements, and though his fingers were clumsy at first, they moved with intention. Yusuke didn't correct him much. He let the boy find the rhythm again on his own, just as he had once taught him, not by words, but by watching and doing. In the late afternoon, as they rested beneath the shade of a leaning pine, Yusuke asked quietly if Haruto had felt afraid. The boy didn't answer right away. He picked at a blade of grass, twisting it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. Then he said, "Sometimes. But mostly I just wanted to come home. Every day I counted how many turns of the sun it had been. I knew once the shadows got shorter again, it would mean spring was settling and the fields needed me. I knew you'd be waiting." Yusuke looked at him then, this boy who had left as a child and returned as something else, something more. He nodded slowly. "We were waiting, but I think you also brought something back with you. A piece of the world we hadn't seen." Haruto smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it's not as nice as home." They sat like that for a while, letting the quiet rest between them, not heavy this time, but comfortable. And as the wind passed through the tall grasses and the light shifted gold across the hills, Yusuke felt the rare peace that comes when hardship does not vanish, but allows a moment's rest. For in that moment, father and son shared something deeper than land or duty. They shared understanding, woven not through words, but through all that had passed between the silence. That evening unfolded gently, as if the very walls of their home had relaxed with Haruto's return. The air carried a mellow warmth, and the dimming sky was brushed with lavender and rose, colors soft enough to hush even the thoughts that usually buzzed about one's head after a day of labor. Kaori moved about the kitchen area with a kind of quiet joy she tried not to show too obviously. But Yusuke saw it in the way she smoothed the cloth across the serving tray, in how she added just a pinch more seasoning to the rice porridge, and in the way she tucked the corner of Haruto's robe with the care of someone who had missed the weight of it in her hands. The meal that night was not extravagant. It was never extravagant. But it was warm, and it was shared, and every bite felt earned. As they ate, Yusuke watched Haruto from the corner of his eye. The boy was still a boy, but there was a difference now in the way he held his bowl, in how he chewed slowly and listened more than he spoke. His little sister chattered next to him about a beetle she had found in the woodpile, about how it had tried to escape her cupped hands before she let it go by the old plum tree. Haruto laughed gently, without teasing her. It was a simple laugh, but Yusuke noticed the way his eyes didn't crinkle at the corners the way they used to. The world had left a print on his face, faint but permanent. After supper, Yusuke stepped outside and sat on the wooden stoop, stretching his legs and feeling the cool earth under his heels. The night insects had begun their chorus, a steady whirring that rose and fell in waves. Above, the stars blinked out one by one, appearing like forgotten promises. Haruto joined him, his small hands folded in his lap, his gaze lifted to the sky. "Did you see many stars when you were at the port?" Yusuke asked, not looking directly at him. Haruto shook his head. "Not really. There were lanterns everywhere. They made the sky seem far away." Yusuke nodded slowly. "It's different here, quieter. The sky feels closer when it's quiet. They sat in silence for a few more minutes. Then Haruto spoke, not in a rush, but as if the words had been sitting in him, waiting for the right moment to stretch their legs. I didn't mind the work. It was hard, but I could do it. The carrying, the sorting. What I didn't like was how nobody looked at you. Like you weren't there unless they needed something. Like a pot on a shelf. Yusuke sighed softly. That's the part that never gets easier. The weight in your arms changes with the years, but being treated like you're invisible, that's the weight that grows heavier. Haruto didn't reply, but he leaned his shoulder against his father's arm, just slightly. It was the kind of gesture that said, I understand now, even if I wish I didn't. The crickets carried on around them, and in the distance, someone's dog barked once, then settled. Inside, Kaori was laying out the sleeping mats, carefully fluffing the corners and adjusting the coals in the hearth to keep the chill off during the night. Her movements had slowed, not from weariness, but from contentment. For the first time in many days, she would sleep knowing her children were under the same roof, breathing the same night air. That was a luxury not every mother in the village could claim. When Yusuke and Haruto came in, the house felt just a little smaller, but in the way a home should feel, full and warm, not crowded. The mats were arranged so that Haruto lay between his parents, his sister curled up beside him like a cat, already half asleep. Yusuke lay on his back, hands behind his head, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. His body ached from the day's labor, but his mind had quieted in a way he hadn't felt in some time. Before drifting into sleep, he turned his head slightly and looked at Haruto. The boy's eyes were closed now, his breaths deep and even. Yusuke watched him for a moment, then whispered, not loud enough to wake him, but softly enough to let the words settle between them. "You did well, my son." The fire cracked once, soft and low, and outside the wind sighed through the branches like an old friend easing into conversation. The night deepened, folding itself gently around the small house and all its sleeping hearts. Morning came with the scent of rain, not the heavy kind that flattens crops and floods pathways, but the soft, slow drizzle that kisses the earth and leaves everything smelling of renewal. The rooftops glistened under the low light, and the paddy fields shimmered like glass bowls left out in the open, waiting to be filled. Yusuke stood at the doorway, watching the sky in silence. The clouds were thick but not menacing, hanging low enough that the tops of the hills disappeared into their folds. It would be a day of interrupted work, he knew, but he welcomed the pause. Inside, Kaori had prepared a simple breakfast, more broth than grain, but enough to warm the stomach and ease the joints into motion. Haruto rose a little later than usual, rubbing sleep from his eyes and blinking at the soft grey light filtering through the window. His little sister had already claimed his spot by the hearth and was making quiet humming noises as she played with a handful of pebbles, arranging them into neat circles that only she understood the purpose of. When Haruto sat beside her, she didn't speak, just leaned against him in a way that said more than words ever could. After breakfast, Yusuke took Haruto with him to the edge of the fields, not to work, but to walk. The ground was too wet for planting, but the channels needed checking, and the narrow footpaths that wove through the terraces often collected debris when the rains came. They moved slowly, stopping now and then to lift a fallen branch or clear a patch of leaves. It was the kind of work that asked little from the body but gave the mind space to breathe. As they walked, Yusuke spoke softly about the land. How the slope of the field affected the water flow, how the presence of frogs meant the soil was healthy. How to watch the wind, to know when the rain would shift. Haruto listened intently, asking questions now and then, not out of obligation, but curiosity. He had been away long enough to understand that knowledge like this was more than wisdom. It was survival. They paused near the old cedar that marked the turn in the path, its wide roots pushing up through the soil like the knuckles of an ancient hand. Yusuke placed a palm against the trunk, feeling its roughness, the way it held steady even in strong winds. He looked at Haruto then and said, "Some years the rice grows tall and fat, and it feels like the land is giving back everything we asked of it. Other years we do everything right and still come up short. You can do your best, and it might not be enough. That's not your fault, it just means you keep going." Haruto nodded, not in a child's eager way, but slowly, as someone who had begun to understand what it meant. He placed his own hand beside his father's on the bark and felt the rough texture under his fingers. The silence between them stretched long and comfortable. When they returned home, the rain had eased into a mist, and Kaori had begun airing out the futons, hanging them briefly in the breeze to shake off the damp. She looked up as they approached, her hands still gripping the edge of the fabric, and smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't show teeth, didn't stretch wide, but lived quietly at the corners of the eyes. The rest of the day moved at a slower pace. Haruto helped his sister repair the little straw doll she had made from scraps. Kaori sorted herbs, grinding dried roots with a stone pestle, while humming a song her mother had taught her. Yusuke carved a new handle for the hoe that had splintered earlier in the week, his fingers steady and precise. Nothing extraordinary happened, but in the quiet weaving of tasks and presents, something solid formed again, a rhythm, a steadiness that had been missing since the taxes had come due. That evening, they sat together watching the fire, the room filled with the scent of smoke and roasted barley. Outside, the mist thickened again, wrapping the village in a quiet hush. And inside, the family rested, not because the world had become easier, but because for now it had given them a brief, blessed pause. In the stillness that followed the rain, the village returned to its usual cadence with a softness that felt earned. The next morning arrived with a pale sun, struggling through scattered clouds, its light filtered and uncertain, but bright enough to remind everyone that the work must resume. Water glistened across the fields, pooling in the dips between rows, reflecting the sky like broken mirrors scattered across the land. Yusuke tied the bindings around his calves and stepped into the water, the cold lapping just above his ankles. Beside him, Haruto mirrored the motion, his younger hands slower but careful, watching the way his father pressed the soil around the shoots and mimicking each gesture with quiet focus. They worked like that for a long while, without much speaking, just the sound of sloshing water, the occasional rustle of reeds, and the distant call of crows circling above. These moments held their own kind of language. There was no need to fill them with chatter. The space between words held memory and instruction, the kind passed from father to son, across centuries, learned through repetition and shared silence rather than anything written down. Yusuke occasionally glanced over at his son and felt something settle in his chest. It wasn't pride exactly, or not just pride, but a mixture of awe and melancholy. Haruto had grown in the space between his last step into the house and his first one back. Not taller, but firmer somehow, like a young tree that had survived its first storm and no longer bent so easily. By midday, the sun had gained strength, pulling moisture from the earth in steaming tendrils. Kaori brought them barley tea in a small gourd flask, her feet bare and skirt hitched just above the mud as she crossed the narrow path toward the edge of the field. Haruto grinned at her approach and took the flask with both hands, bowing slightly before sipping. She wiped his forehead with a cloth, the gesture quick but filled with care, and Yusuke caught the way her hand lingered for just a second longer than necessary before pulling away. She had missed this tiny, wordless contact that told her he was still hers, still under her care. That afternoon, Haruto stayed behind to help Kaori with the drying mats. They laid out bundles of straw in the yard to be turned and checked for mildew, a tedious but essential task. He asked questions Kaori hadn't expected, how she decided which stalks to save, what the best day was to start fermenting radish, why she placed smooth stones in the jars of pickles. She answered each with a slow smile, glad for the curiosity and for the chance to pass on things that were rarely written down, things that would one day vanish if not spoken aloud to someone who cared enough to ask. Yusuke watched them from a distance as he repaired the small fence near the back, his hands busy, but his eyes always returning to the pair of them. There was something comforting in the way their voices wove together, low and steady, like a thread stitching their home life back into shape. That evening, the family gathered early near the fire, the hearth still warm from Kaori's cooking. She had prepared something special, not in terms of luxury, but of intention. Thin slices of yam with dried greens, grilled over coals and sprinkled with salt she had traded for last autumn. The smell alone lifted spirits, and when they ate, they did so slowly, savoring every bite like it might be the last warm meal before another storm. Yusuke shared a memory from his own childhood then, a rare one, about how his own father used to sing an old fisherman's song on nights like these. He sang a few bars in a voice rough with time and quiet from disuse. Haruto's eyes lit up, and Kaori chuckled softly, nudging Yusuke's shoulder and saying it had been years since she'd heard him sing anything that wasn't a chant to the vegetables in the field. They laughed together, the kind of laughter that doesn't echo, but folds inward and warms the chest. For a while, there was nothing outside their walls but the fire's glow and the faint sound of the wind shifting through the trees. Haruto lay back on the mat, staring up at the dark beams above, and whispered, "It's good to be home." His words floated between them and stayed there, resting in the air like smoke curling into the corners of the room and settling quietly into the wood and clay that held them all together. And as the night stretched further and the fire dimmed, sleep came to them, not in the usual weary collapse of labor, but like a long breath exhaled in peace. For now the tax collectors were not knocking, the storehouse was far away, and the only burden left was that of memory, a burden made lighter by its sharing. By the time the week had turned again, the village had settled into a spring that no longer felt uncertain. The earth had warmed enough to coax blossoms from the hedgerows, and soft petals now floated down the narrow footpaths like a slow-moving snow that carried no cold. The scent of new life hung in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of smoke from cooking fires and the deeper, older aroma of tilled soil. In Yusuke's fields, rows of young rice plants reached toward the sky in orderly lines, their tips a vivid green that stirred gently with every breath of wind. Haruto moved through the paddies with more confidence now. His feet knew where to step, his hands no longer fumbled, and when he turned to speak, it was often to point out something small but worth noticing: a new frog near the sluice gate, a bird's nest nestled under the eaves of the tool shed, the particular angle of sunlight that made the water shimmer like gold. It was in these quiet observations that Yusuke began to feel something shift, not just in his son but in himself. He had spent so many years weighed down by duty that he had almost forgotten how to look at the world through curious eyes. Haruto's return had not only restored a piece of the family's rhythm, but had reawakened in Yusuke the capacity to feel wonder, even in the midst of hardship. He found himself pausing more often now, watching the way light filtered through the bamboo, noticing the patterns of moss on the stones near the water's edge. These moments didn't make the taxes lighter or the future less uncertain, but they gave the day a kind of quiet richness that could not be taken by tribute or storm. One evening, as the sun slid behind the hills and the sky turned the color of fading embers, Haruto asked if they could visit the shrine at the top of the old path. It was a small shrine, barely more than a wooden box with a sloping roof and a few worn offerings, nestled among the trees, where the mountain began its gentle climb. Yusuke looked at him for a long moment before nodding. It was a place he hadn't visited since the last offering festival months ago, and he hadn't expected Haruto to remember it so clearly. They gathered a few coins, a pinch of rice, and a strip of cloth dyed with crushed indigo, and set off together, walking slowly as the last light softened the village behind them. The path was narrow and quiet, lined with grasses that had grown tall and soft from the rains. Their footsteps were muted, more breath than sound. As they walked, Haruto asked about the shrine's origin, and Yusuke told him the story his father had told him, of the wandering monk who had once rested under that same tree during a drought, and how, after his prayer, rain had come within the week. It wasn't a grand tale, but it held the kind of sacred simplicity that made it feel true, even if its details had blurred over time. When they reached the shrine, the clearing was bathed in the pale blue of twilight. Yusuke handed the rice to Haruto, who placed it carefully at the base of the wooden altar, then bowed low with his hands pressed together. Yusuke followed, murmuring a silent thanks, not for blessings received, but for endurance granted. Behind them, the first stars had begun to flicker into view. They lingered for a while longer, neither eager to leave the hush of that small sacred space. The shrine was not grand, but it offered something more valuable than gold or grain, a sense of pause, a reminder that life, even when bound by the weight of seasons and tax scrolls, still offered moments of peace. As they made their way back down, Yusuke placed a hand on Haruto's shoulder. He didn't speak, but the gesture said what words could not. That he was grateful, that he was proud, that the boy he had raised was becoming someone strong enough to carry more than just baskets or bundles of straw. That night, Kaori waited for them by the fire, a pot of miso warming gently, and the faint hum of a lullaby rising from her throat. When they returned, she looked at them both and simply said, "You were gone a while." Haruto smiled and nodded, sliding down beside his sister, who had already begun to doze, her thumb still tucked beneath her cheek. Yusuke took his place near the hearth, stretching out his legs with a sigh that came from somewhere deep inside. Not from exhaustion, but from a full, quiet contentment that felt as rare as it was welcome. The flames danced low across the walls, the wind had gone still. And for that night, at least, time seemed to slow, stretching itself like a long shadow across the earth, holding everything in its gentle embrace. The warmth of that peaceful night lingered in their bones, even as the days pressed on. It was as though the visit to the shrine had carved out a quiet space within their hearts, one untouched by the usual tides of worry. In the morning, the village stirred with its usual song, the rhythm of wooden sandals clapping against packed dirt, the splash of water poured from clay jars, the low thrum of hose striking soil. But beneath it all, there was a certain ease that hadn't been felt in months. Haruto awoke with his sister's tangled hair brushing his cheek and the scent of barley porridge already floating from the hearth. Kaori moved through the home with a rhythm that was almost musical, and Yusuke stepped into his straw sandals, with a steadiness that made even the sky seem more reliable. That day brought with it a rare kind of calm. The skies remained soft and clear, the breeze light and sweet with the scent of budding herbs from the hills. Yusuke and Haruto spent much of the morning near the boundary of their field, where a stone wall marked the border between their land and the sloping path toward the forest. There, small trees had begun to bloom in hesitant clusters, white blossoms that fluttered like moth wings and reminded Yusuke of the first time Haruto had walked there as a toddler, chasing petals like they were secrets drifting just beyond his reach. Now the boy stood taller at the top of his head, brushing Yusuke's shoulder, his movements patient and practiced. They repaired the edges of the irrigation canal, placing small stones and compacting the banks with their hands, working side by side without the need for much talk. Sometimes, silence was more generous than speech. The occasional bird call filled the air, and the sound of water trickling through the channels made a gentle background to their thoughts. In the stillness, Yusuke felt something loosen in his chest, not release exactly, but a recognition that things for now were as they should be. Later, as the sun shifted higher, casting sharp shadows along the rooftops and fields, Kaori called them in for a midday rest. She had prepared pickled radish and cold tea, and they sat in the shade beside the house, the air filled with the rustle of tall grass and the hum of bees weaving between wildflowers. Haruto spoke of something he had heard during his time at the port, about a merchant who claimed to have seen a fish so large it could swallow a child whole, and how the other boys had argued over whether such a thing was possible. His little sister widened her eyes in mock horror and clung to his sleeve, and Kaori laughed softly, brushing a speck of rice from the corner of his mouth like he was 5 again. Yusuke watched the scene with a quiet kind of wonder, not because it was rare, but because it was whole. These were the moments they had clung to during the hardest days, the imagined return, the shared meals, the sound of their children's voices rising in playful tones. They were not extravagant dreams, not grand or glittering, but they were precious in a way that only those who had almost lost them could understand. But as the afternoon wore on and shadows lengthened, a small sound broke the spell, a sharp tapping at the gate. Yusuke stood instinctively, his body suddenly tense in a way he hadn't felt since Haruto's departure. Kaori stilled beside him, one hand resting on her lap, eyes fixed on the doorway. Haruto's expression shifted too, though he masked it quickly. The tapping came again, louder this time, not urgent, but firm. When Yusuke stepped outside, he saw what he had expected, though not what he had hoped. It was one of the magistrate's men, dressed in the plain brown robes of a district runner, scroll tucked into his belt and a satchel slung across his chest. He bowed briefly, then handed Yusuke the scroll without a word. His face betrayed no malice, but no kindness either. He was simply doing what the world required of him. After another short bow, the man turned and walked back down the path, his figure disappearing behind the bend before the dust had even settled. Yusuke held the scroll for a long moment before untying the string. The paper was coarse and creased, ink still fresh in places. It was not a summons, not this time. It was a request for grain, 2 sacks worth, to be delivered within the week as a supplementary contribution for the rebuilding of a warehouse damaged during the last storm season. The language was polite, carefully structured to feel like honor rather than obligation. But Yusuke knew better. Requests like these came without room for refusal. He folded the scroll slowly and slipped it into his sleeve before returning to the shaded spot beside the house. Haruto looked up at him, and Yusuke forced a small smile. He would explain it later. Not now, not while the day still held light and the tea was still warm. That evening, after supper, Yusuke and Kaori sat beside the fire as the children dozed nearby. They didn't speak of the scroll. Not yet. They simply listened to the soft crackle of flame and the quiet breathing of their children, and let the silence wrap around them again, holding it like a thread, stretched but unbroken. The days that followed moved with an uneasy rhythm, like a song that had lost its chorus, but continued anyway out of habit. Yusuke kept the scroll folded neatly in a reed basket by the hearth, where its edges peeked out like the corner of a bad memory. He hadn't yet told Haruto or Kaori the full contents. He had only mentioned that a delivery was expected soon, a word he chose carefully, one that sounded far less menacing than the truth it carried. The truth was that 2 sacks of rice, 2 full sacks, would leave them bare for the month, forcing them to thin their meals, tighten their belts, and lean once more into the uneasy grace of survival. The truth was that the grain they'd be sending off would never be tasted by those who planted it. It would be swept away, like so many offerings laid before a shrine to a god who never spoke back. Still, Yusuke worked. He rose before the birds, shoulders stiff, fingers cracked, and slipped quietly into the field, where the water reflected the morning sky like a quiet promise. Haruto followed him most days, silent at first, but quick to match his pace. The boy asked fewer questions now, though not out of disinterest. He was watching, calculating, trying to read between the lines of what wasn't being said. He noticed when Kaori measured out the rice with a more cautious hand. He noticed when Yusuke counted and recounted the stored bundles in the shed late into the evening. And though no one spoke of the request from the magistrate, it was beginning to live between them like a third presence in every room. One evening, as the last light of day slipped behind the hills and the fire in the hearth had dimmed to a sleepy glow, Haruto sat with his back against the wooden beam near the door. Yusuke sat across from him, sharpening a sickle with slow, measured strokes. The scraping sound was steady, soothing almost, and for a while they said nothing. Then Haruto spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "It's about the scroll, isn't it?" Yusuke didn't look up, but the stone paused against the blade. "They want rice," Haruto said, not as a question, but a statement. "More than we can give." Yusuke looked at him then, the sickle resting across his knees. For a long moment, he searched for the right reply, something that could soften the edge of the truth. But in Haruto's eyes, he saw no need for softening. The boy already knew. What he needed was not comfort, but clarity. So Yusuke nodded. "Yes, 2 sacks, before the end of the week." Haruto's jaw tightened slightly, and he nodded in return. There was no outrage, no storm. Only the slow folding in of understanding, like cloth wrapped around a bruise. The next day, the family worked together in the Tia storage hut, selecting which bundles to send. Kaori weighed each tightly wound sheath of straw, her fingers moving with the grace of someone who had done this too many times. Haruto carried them to the measuring board, stacking them neatly, his steps sure. Yusuke tied the bundles into larger parcels, preparing them for transport. They worked without conversation, but not without purpose. There was something almost sacred in the way they moved, as if honoring each grain by touch, acknowledging the weight of what was being taken. By the time the sun reached its highest point, they had enough. Just enough. Kaori placed her palm flat on the final bundle, then withdrew it slowly, her fingertips brushing the straw like a parting goodbye. Haruto fetched the cart from beside the shed, the wooden wheels squeaking faintly as he rolled it over the dirt path. When it was loaded, Yusuke tied a cloth across the top, not to hide it, but to shield it from dust. He glanced once at the sky, then turned to Haruto. "I'll take it. You stay here. Help your mother." Haruto didn't protest. He just gave a single nod, then stood beside the cart as Yusuke took the handles. As Yusuke began his slow walk toward the collection point near the village center, the weight of the rice seemed heavier than usual, though he had pulled the cart many times before. It wasn't just the physical load, it was what it represented: weeks of labor, meals not yet eaten, strength not yet recovered. And still, it had to be given. The village, the law, the way of things, all demanded it. Kaori watched him go from the doorway, her hand resting gently on Haruto's shoulder. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The path had already been chosen, carved long before their time. All they could do now was walk it with what dignity remained. That night, when Yusuke returned with the cart empty and his shoulders low, the fire was already lit and supper was ready. Haruto rose and helped him remove his sandals, his hand steady. Kaori handed him a warm bowl without a word. And in that simple act, something unspoken passed between them all, a small defiance. They would bend, but they would not break. Not tonight. That night passed slowly like water moving under thick ice. Sleep came to the household, but not easily, and certainly not in peace. The straw mats rustled often. Kaori turned more times than usual. Haruto shifted, murmuring in his dreams, and Yusuke lay flat on his back for hours, eyes open, staring into the dark beams above as though answers were hidden in the wood grain. Outside, the wind had picked up. Not loud, not wild, but constant, whispering through the narrow lanes and ruffling the trees with the persistence of an old spirit, searching for something it had long forgotten. Yusuke eventually rose just after the first bird call, long before the others. The fire had burned low, but he didn't stir it. Instead, he stepped outside and stood barefoot in the cool soil, letting the wind move through his hair. There was a numbness in him now, but it wasn't born of despair. It was the kind of stillness that came after giving away what little you had and realizing you were still standing. The cart had been emptied, the rice handed off, the scroll acknowledged. The system had taken its share, and for now it had retreated. He was no more free than before, but he was no longer waiting for the knock. That, in itself, was something. Later, when Kaori joined him, she said nothing at first. She just slipped her arm through his and leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. For a moment, the two of them stood like statues carved from the same story, rooted in the earth, gazing out toward the fields, as if by simply looking long enough, they could will something new into being. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and slow, like someone reading a line from memory. "We'll manage," she said. "We always do." That day unfolded with the soft ache of recovery, the kind of day that didn't ask for much but still required more than anyone had to give. Meals were simpler, the broth thinner. They chewed slower, spoke less, saved more. Haruto didn't complain, didn't ask for more rice or an extra plum. He took his portion with a polite nod, even smiled once when his sister offered him half of hers. Yusuke noticed it, how the boy had learned the quiet skill of going without while making others feel like he was content. That was something the poor learned without instruction, a kind of grace in the face of scarcity that the well-fed would never understand. In the afternoon, Yusuke returned to the edge of the field with Haruto at his side. The earth had dried enough to walk the embankments, though the lowest furrows were still soft and slick with water. They worked slowly, restacking stones that had come loose and brushing away algae that had formed near the channel mouths. Haruto crouched low, running his fingers along the mossy edge of a rock. He pointed to a trail of small fish darting beneath the surface. "Even they know where the shelter is," he said softly. "They hide near the edges, where the water's slower." Yusuke crouched beside him, following his gaze. "The center's too open," he replied. "Too exposed. Out there you're easy to catch." He didn't have to say more. Haruto understood. The words hung there between them, a quiet agreement about more than fish. That night, Kaori surprised them. She had held back a bit of millet, just enough to make a small sweet cake. It was barely the size of her palm and not as sweet as she would have liked, but she shaped it carefully, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it in Haruto's hand after supper. "For tomorrow?" she said, then kissed the top of his head like she used to when he was still small enough to carry. Haruto smiled, a real one this time, and held the wrapped treat like it was a treasure. It was not the food itself that mattered. It was what it represented, a gesture of care in a world that asked more than it gave. They slept early that night. The fire burned warm, the mats felt softer somehow, and for a while the silence didn't press so heavily on their chests. Yusuke closed his eyes and listened to the slow, even breathing of his family. Kaori beside him, her hand resting lightly on his wrist. Haruto curled beside his sister, the faint scent of straw in his hair. For a few hours at least, the world outside their home could be forgotten. Yet even in rest, Yusuke knew the weight hadn't vanished. It had only shifted, like a heavy pack moved from one shoulder to the other. The taxes had been met for now, the scroll had been answered. But the season was long and the harvest still far off. And somewhere in the distance, more requests would come, each one wrapped in the same hollow politeness, each one heavier than the last. Still he held on to the warmth of that night, showed the way the shadows danced gently along the walls and the wind finally softened as if satisfied, finally ready to let them sleep. The next morning arrived not with any grand change, but with the soft steadiness of routine that had become its own form of resilience. The sky wore a dull blue like old cloth, the wind stirred gently without urgency, and the scent of moist earth carried on the breeze like a quiet reminder of the work that still waited. Yusuke stirred early, his joints stiff from the week's labor, and moved about the home with the practiced care of someone who knew how easily noise could break the delicate peace of a sleeping house. He lit the coals with a slow breath and stood for a moment watching the first curl of smoke rise up into the quiet room. When Haruto appeared, rubbing his eyes and dragging his feet with the grogginess of a boy growing into a man too quickly, Yusuke simply nodded at him and handed him a damp cloth to wipe his face. No words were exchanged at first, only the quiet shuffle of sandals and the gentle creak of wood beneath their feet. Later, as they chewed on leftover rice and drank tea that was more water than flavor, Haruto placed the small wrapped sweet his mother had given him on the table. "We'll share it," he said, his voice still rough with sleep but steady. Yusuke glanced at him, surprised but not entirely. He knew his son, knew his heart. He nodded once, and they broke the cake into small pieces, each savoring their portion without pretending it was more than it was. As the sun climbed higher, they returned to the fields where the days were beginning to grow warmer. The earth gave beneath their toes with a gentle resistance, and the water in the paddies shimmered under the morning light. The tasks were familiar now, less of a burden with Haruto beside him. They checked the chutes, adjusted the flow between channels, and repaired a wooden gate that had begun to lean after the last rain. Yusuke moved slowly, but with purpose, his eyes always scanning for anything that might later become a problem. Haruto matched his pace, his silence no longer unsure but measured, the kind of silence that came from concentration. Around midday, Kaori appeared at the path's edge, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. She sat beside them on the embankment, passing out pieces of pickled plum and salted beans. They ate in the shade of a low willow, their bodies folded into the calm of a family at rest. Haruto spoke of the birds nesting near the shed, and Kaori laughed when he described their frantic fluttering every time he passed by with a basket. Even Yusuke allowed himself a soft chuckle, the sound more breath than voice, but sincere. For a moment, it felt as if the world outside their field didn't exist, as if the taxes, the scrolls, the demands of men they'd never meet, all lived far away in a place that had no power here. But moments like these never lasted long. That evening, as they returned home, Yusuke noticed a man waiting near the gate of the neighboring field. He wore no official seal, no formal robes, just plain clothes dusted with the road's wear. But something in the way he stood made Yusuke pause. The man nodded as he approached, his tone polite but direct. "Word is, more collections may be needed soon," he said. "Not from you, not yet, just spreading the news. The warehouse rebuild has run short again." Yusuke kept his expression still, thanked the man with a bow, and watched as he walked off down the road. The message was not an order, not even a request, but it hung in the air like smoke. Another round would come. It always did. As he stepped inside his home, he saw Kaori and Haruto preparing the evening meal, laughter low between them. He didn't speak of the man, not yet. He sat quietly and helped peel radishes, each movement deliberate, as if the rhythm of slicing could somehow delay what might come. That night, the wind returned, soft but steady, brushing across the roof and rustling the reed mats. Yusuke lay beside Kaori, their hands nearly touching, but not quite, listening to the hush of sleeping children and the faint creak of wood settling into silence. He stared at the ceiling, watching shadows drift like clouds across the beams. He thought of the grains they had already given, the meals they had already stretched thin, and wondered how many more seasons the earth could offer before there was nothing left to trade but time itself. And yet in the quiet, he also thought of the way Haruto smiled when he spoke of birds, the way Kaori touched his hand when she passed him the tea, the way his daughter curled beside her brother like a vine climbing toward the sun. These small things did not solve anything, but they were not small to him. The morning after that quiet warning slipped through their gate. Yusuke awoke before the first rooster had summoned the light. The sky still wore the deep charcoal hue of night, and only the faintest streak of blue hinted at the coming day. He lay on his back for a few moments, listening to the house around him breathe. The floor creaked softly in its slumber, a subtle language that only someone who had lived there long enough would understand. Kaori's breath was slow and steady, her hand resting loosely near the edge of his mat, just close enough to reach if needed. Haruto and his sister were curled under the same blanket, their silhouettes still and small in the faint glow that filtered in from the shutter's edge. Yusuke rose without sound, stepped over the woven mat and onto the earthen floor, and made his way outside. The wind had changed overnight. It no longer carried the scent of wet soil and spring blossoms, but instead it brought with it the drier notes of old dust, of trails well tread and grain sacks emptied too soon. There was something in that wind that made him uneasy, though he could not name it. Perhaps it was the rhythm of repetition, how the same notices kept arriving, how the same demands kept resurfacing under different names. He looked out over the quiet fields, their stillness complete, as if the land itself was pausing before another season of toil. Later that morning, Kaori set about preparing pickles from the last of the winter radish. Her hands moved quickly, washing and slicing with care, layering salt and spice in the old jar that had belonged to Yusuke's mother. The brine bubbled faintly when she pressed the lid down, and she placed a flat stone on top to weigh it all down evenly. Haruto watched her work and then offered to carry the jar to the cool storage dugout behind the house. She hesitated only a moment before nodding, and as he stepped outside with it balanced carefully in his arms, she watched him go with the quiet eyes of a mother who sees both boy and man walking in one body. Out in the field, Yusuke had already begun to till the upper rows. He paused when he saw Haruto return from the storage pit, wiping his hands on his robe. The boy said nothing at first, only joined his father and began turning the soil with his heel, loosening patches that had hardened under the dry wind. They worked like that for a while, the silence between them neither heavy nor empty, just filled with the slow rhythm of shared labor. Eventually Haruto straightened, his cheeks flushed, and said softly, "If they come again, will we have anything left to give?" Yusuke didn't answer immediately. He stood with his back to the sun, his eyes cast over the field, as though looking there might reveal a solution. "There's always something," he said finally, not with confidence, but with a weary kind of truth. "It may not be what they ask for, but we'll find something." Haruto nodded, but the tension in his brow didn't ease. He had known hunger before, but now he was old enough to recognize its slow approach long before it arrived. That recognition had its own weight. Still, he didn't press the subject. He picked up a rake and moved to the next row, his movements a little slower now, more deliberate. That evening, after supper, Yusuke gathered a small cloth pouch and filled it with a few dried plums, a handful of barley, and a folded strip of woven cotton from Kaori's sewing box. He didn't explain his actions, he just wrapped the pouch tightly and placed it in the wooden drawer near the hearth. Kaori noticed, of course. She always did, but she didn't ask. She only met his eyes for a moment across the firelight, then returned to darning a pair of worn socks with thread that had already been used twice. They were preparing in the only ways they could, not for war or flood or famine, but for the slow, grinding erosion that came with a system that asked endlessly and gave nothing in return. Later, when the children had drifted into sleep, Yusuke stepped outside again. The stars were out, scattered like grains across the dark velvet of the sky. He listened to the night and thought of his father, who once said that the stars were the only lights no lord could tax. It had seemed like poetry then, something nice to whisper to a child. But now, older, worn and wiser, Yusuke understood the quiet rebellion in those words. The stars remained free and distant, no matter how many scrolls came, no matter how many carts left their gate. He stood there for a long time, hands clasped behind his back, the wind cool against his face. The future would come, as it always did. But for this night, he stood beneath a sky that owed no tax, watched over a field that still whispered of spring, and carried the weight of survival, not with bitterness, but with the quiet grace of a man who refused to be broken. The next day dawned with a quiet coolness that clung to the walls like mist. It was not cold enough to chill the bones, but carried a certain stillness that made the world feel paused between moments. Yusuke was the first to rise again, though this time he lingered by the hearth, his fingers hovering above the embers before gently coaxing them back to life. The house remained hushed, the sort of hush that stretched and folded over itself. Not quite peace, but not unease either. He could hear the faint rustling of Kaori shifting beneath her blanket, and the soft, steady breathing of the children. There was a strange comfort in that gentle chorus, a reminder that in this small house, at least, time was still theirs to shape. As the morning brightened, Haruto stepped out into the yard with a stretch, his sleeves pushed up and his hair slightly tousled. Without needing instruction, he fetched the small bucket and began collecting water from the well. His movements were practiced now, efficient. Yusuke watched from the doorway, sipping warm tea and noting with quiet pride how his son no longer waited to be asked. It wasn't about obedience, it was about understanding the rhythm of their life, the unspoken tasks that must be done simply because they belonged to no one else. They spent the day turning compost into the far edge of the field, where the soil had thinned near the boundary stones. It was hard work, not because of the weight, but because of the repetition, the endless lift and scatter, the bending and straightening. Yet neither of them complained. Occasionally, Haruto would point out a small beetle or a peculiar patch of weeds, and Yusuke would grunt or nod, offering a small lesson or anecdote drawn from memory. These conversations drifted like the wind, brief and gentle, and then vanished, leaving behind only the comfort of shared company. In the late afternoon, a neighbor passed by, an older man named Kenta, whose beard had gone almost entirely white. He carried a small bundle of dried fish, tied with twine, and offered it with a soft greeting. Kaori accepted it with a warm bow, placing it aside to add to their stew later. They stood and chatted for a moment, the way people do when they need more than news, when what they really seek is to measure the tone in another's voice to see if they too carry the same quiet fears. Kenta mentioned rumors of another official passing through the nearby district, of more villages being asked to offer not just rice this time, but linen, tools, even laborers for public work. After he left, Kaori returned to her sewing with slower hands. The silence between her and Yusuke deepened, not heavy, but more contemplative than usual. There was no panic, no sudden plan, just the deepening awareness that the next turn in the road might come sooner than expected. But as evening settled in and they gathered again by the fire, the family shared their meal with bowed heads and murmured thanks. The stew, now rich with fish and root vegetables, filled the room with warmth. And in that circle of light, the world once again felt smaller, more manageable, and for a little while, enough. The following morning arrived with that grey, smudged quality that sometimes settled over the village when the skies refused to fully commit to either rain or sun. There was a thickness to the air, not heavy with heat, but filled with a strange waiting, like a held breath that had not yet been released. Yusuke stood by the threshold of the house, one hand on the old wooden post, worn smooth from years of passing palms, and stared across the paddies. The green of the young rice shoots was brighter than usual, vivid against the pale water and the low clouds above. There was beauty in that stillness, but it was a beauty Yusuke had learned to distrust. Too often, calm like this had been the quiet before a new burden arrived. Kaori moved through the house with quiet grace, folding dried clothes, sorting lentils by hand, her thoughts clearly occupied, though her fingers worked without fault. Haruto had already stepped outside, his voice drifting back through the open window as he hummed something under his breath, a tune he had picked up from the fishermen near the coast. Yusuke listened for a moment before turning to the tools laid out by the door, selecting the hoe that had been recently sharpened and the short-bladed sickle for trimming weeds. his hands wrapped easily around the wood, palms rough and familiar with every nick and groove. By midday, they had cleared the path that ran between the house and the southern edge of the field, pulling up the stubborn patches of grass that always tried to reclaim the walkway. Haruto worked with his usual energy, though today his movements held a sharpness, a certain force behind them that Yusuke recognized. It wasn't frustration exactly. It was the effort of pushing away thoughts that couldn't yet be solved. The boy wanted to ask about the rumors they'd heard from Kenta, about whether they too would be expected to give more than they already had, but he hadn't found the right moment. Yusuke, for his part, didn't force the conversation. He knew it would come in time. That moment arrived as they sat beneath the old persimmon tree that marked the edge of their property, sharing a flask of barley tea Kaori had sent out with them. The air had grown warmer, and Haruto leaned back on his hands, watching the clouds roll lazily across the sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost casual. "If they ask for labor," he said, "would they take someone like me?" Yusuke looked at him, the boy's profile still lined with the softness of youth, despite the calloused hands and sun-darkened skin. He didn't answer right away, and when he did, it was not with certainty. "They might," he said, "especially if others cannot give enough. They take what they can." Haruto nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of those words. It wasn't fear that clouded his face, but the calculation of possibilities of what might be asked and how far they could stretch themselves before something broke. "Would you let them?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a son trying to understand the limits of his father's protection. Yusuke didn't flinch. "If it comes to that," he replied, "we will decide together." It wasn't an evasion. It was a promise, one that honored Haruto's growing place in the decisions of the household. That evening, Kaori prepared miso with wild greens and grilled strips of dried tofu softened in broth. The meal was simple, but the warmth of it spread easily through their limbs. Yusuke noticed that she had placed a second pot to the side, covered carefully and tucked beside the coals to stay warm. When he asked about it, she only said, "In case Kenta passes by again." It was a small gesture, but one born from the old way of living. Give, so that someone might one day give back. The unspoken understanding that in a world ruled by demands from above, the only refuge left was found in the kindness exchanged between neighbors. That night, the wind rose again, whispering along the eaves and stirring the reeds outside. Yusuke sat up late, his thoughts quiet but not still, while Kaori mended one of Haruto's worn undershirts, the needle glinting faintly in the firelight. Haruto, curled up near the doorway with his sister's head resting lightly on his arm, had already slipped into sleep. The glow from the hearth cast gentle shadows across the walls, and the house felt, for that one moment, safe. But Yusuke knew how quickly such safety could unravel. Requests wrapped in silk words, demands pressed with polite urgency. The burden always finding its way back to those who had the least to give. Still, he also knew something else. That within the quiet resilience of his home, where every shared glance and silent gesture spoke of loyalty deeper than law, there was strength no tax collector could ever tally. By morning the wind had calmed, leaving behind a stillness that made the world feel paused, like a bowl set gently on a mat and not yet disturbed. The light came slow and gentle through the shutters, painting soft gold lines across the floor, where Kaori was already kneeling, grinding barley with slow, circular motions. The sound of the stone wheel was steady, almost meditative, a background rhythm that had accompanied her for years. Yusuke stirred beside the fire, the warmth from the embers still clinging to his skin as he stretched and let his feet press against the packed earth. Haruto sat up too, blinking at the light and shaking off the last traces of sleep with a quiet yawn. Breakfast was quiet but filling, a simple barley porridge thickened with bits of yam and seasoned with shiso from Kaori's little garden patch. They ate in peace, heads slightly bowed, and for a time no one mentioned the rumors or the scrolls or the weight of the coming season. It was enough just to eat, to listen to the morning birds as they settled into their songs, to sip warm tea and feel it move down the throat like reassurance. Haruto was the first to rise, brushing crumbs from his lap as he stepped outside to begin hauling water for the day. Yusuke followed, and Kaori remained a moment longer, her hand resting on the rim of the empty bowl as if in conversation with the silence. Outside, the light had taken on that soft white of mid-morning, not yet harsh, not quite hazy. The fields welcomed them back like a familiar breath, the mud clinging to their feet, and the stalk standing upright, tender and green. There was comfort in the repetition of labor. Yusuke bent to examine a patch where the seedlings hadn't taken well and began gently replanting the shoots. Haruto worked a short distance away, steady with the rake, humming again under his breath. The hours passed like slow-moving clouds, and though they did not speak much, there was a quiet bond in the labor that required no words. The rhythm of tending, of adjusting, of breathing with the land stitched them once more into the fabric of the season. In that moment, they were not preparing for hardship. They were simply living, and that too was an act of quiet defiance. As the sun leaned westward and the fields began casting longer shadows, the day softened into a kind of quiet that only early evening could bring. The scent of damp earth mingled with the faint sweetness of blossoms carried on the breeze. Yusuke wiped the sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his kimono and glanced across the paddies to where Haruto stood, motionless for a moment, watching a dragonfly skim the water's surface. It hovered, then darted away, vanishing into the tall grass. Haruto lowered his rake and looked toward his father, and Yusuke gave a nod that meant it was time. Together they gathered their tools, shook the mud from their feet, and began the walk back to the house in that easy, companionable silence that often followed long work. Kaori was in the doorway, a bowl in her hands, and her daughter clung to the hem of her robe, half hiding behind it. She smiled when she saw them, and Yusuke noticed the faint smudge of ash on her cheek, a sign she'd been tending the fire most of the afternoon. As they approached, the smell of roasted barley and something spiced filled the air. Supper was nearly ready. Haruto dropped his tools by the shed, rinsed his hands at the basin, and gave his little sister a brief pat on the head as he passed by her into the house. She grinned at him with all the cheerfulness of someone who had spent the day without chores and full of stories made up with pebbles and sticks. Inside, the warmth was immediate, not just from the fire, but from the closeness of the room, the familiar creak of wood, the scent of worn cloth and simmering broth. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, knowing well how thin the season might stretch. Kaori had made a soup, thick with greens and flakes of dried fish, and they drank it gratefully, bowls warm against their palms. Haruto spoke briefly of a frog he'd found buried in the mud and how it startled him with a sudden leap. Even Kaori laughed, her voice soft but clear, a sound that settled the room like a blessing. The night crept in gently, and for the moment they let it come without resistance, holding tight to the warmth and the quiet and the soft rhythm of being together. Night settled over the house like a blanket woven from silence and wind. The sky outside deepened into an ink-stained canvas scattered with soft stars, and the quiet within their walls stretched wide and comforting. After supper, Kaori had tucked their daughter into bed, her lullaby little more than a whisper, but enough to bring a calm weight to the room. Haruto had laid down soon after, arms behind his head, his eyes tracing the shadows that flickered along the rafters. Yusuke, meanwhile, sat by the hearth, poking gently at the coals, his thoughts moving slowly, like a cart on a rutted road. The fire gave a soft crackle, just enough to keep the quiet from swallowing everything whole. Kaori joined him a moment later, her presence folding into the space beside him without needing to announce itself. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a long moment, not to sleep, but to simply rest in the warmth of their small world. Yusuke glanced at her, studying the curve of her cheek in the firelight, the lines around her eyes that had deepened over the years. He remembered the girl she had been, the strength she carried even then, and the way it had only deepened through the seasons of hardship and waiting. She opened her eyes and met his gaze, and in that look passed the unspoken truth that whatever came next, they would meet it together. Outside, the wind stirred the bamboo in gentle waves, a hushed music that only those who lived close to the land truly understood. It spoke not in words, but in rhythms, in the slow breath of branches swaying, and the distant creak of trees bending under their own age. It reminded Yusuke of how time moved in places like this, not in leaps or loud moments, but in small shifts, in meals prepared, in tools repaired, in hands held during quiet moments by the fire. Eventually, Yusuke stood, checked the door, and made sure the fire was safely banked. He returned to his mat beside Kaori and lay down, slowly, knees aching just a little more than they had the week before. As he listened to the breath of his family around him, steady and soft, he let himself sink into that warmth, holding close the calm of this night, unsure of when such peace would return again. Morning came with a fine veil of fog that draped itself over the village like a memory that hadn't yet decided whether to stay or fade. Yusuke stepped outside into the hush, feeling the cold in his bones, though not unpleasantly so. It was the kind of cold that made the world feel cleaner somehow, more still. The fields lay hidden under a soft mist, their rose vanishing into white as if swallowed by dreams not yet woken. He stood quietly for a moment, arms crossed over his chest, watching his breath curl into the air like the steam of warm rice. There was no urgency in the moment, only a kind of pause that the land gave him before the day asked for more. Back inside, Kaori was already at the hearth, stirring a thin porridge and slicing pickled daikon. The smell filled the small room with a tangy sharpness that reminded Yusuke of seasons long past, when pickles were all they had, some winters. Haruto sat near the fire, combing straw through his fingers, his eyes half-lidded from sleep, but alert enough to notice his father's entrance. They shared a glance and a nod, both knowing the chores would begin soon, but neither in a rush to disturb the calm that still lingered. After breakfast, they set to work in the eastern paddies, where the embankments had loosened from the last rain and needed shoring up. Yusuke showed Haruto how to place the stones more tightly, digging into the earth with a practiced rhythm that seemed more art than labor. Haruto watched carefully, mimicking the placement, testing the strength of each angle. They worked for hours, speaking little, yet there was conversation in their movements, in the handing of stones, in the quiet corrections that didn't need words. By the time the sun had climbed high, they sat together beneath a crooked tree near the canal, eating rice balls Kaori had wrapped in cloth. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of knowing how much effort lay behind each simple thing. Yusuke looked at his son and saw more than a boy growing taller. He saw someone learning the weight of survival and still standing straight beneath it. That knowledge filled him with a quiet pride, one he didn't speak aloud but carried deep in his chest as they packed their things and rose again, ready to meet whatever the land would ask next. The wind began to pick up in the late afternoon, curling through the trees and slipping beneath the eaves of the house with a curious persistence. It wasn't strong enough to unsettle anything, but it brought with it the smell of something distant, the kind of scent that made old farmers look up from their work and squint toward the horizon. Yusuke noticed it while gathering kindling from behind the shed. He paused, nose turned slightly to the breeze, catching the faintest traces of salt and ash. It wasn't fire, not yet, but it reminded him of when the sea wind pushed inland during certain seasons, when the coast sent warnings through the air long before anything arrived by road. Inside, Kaori was rinsing barley in the wooden basin, her sleeves pushed up to the elbows, her hands red from the cold water. She was humming to herself, the tune, old and nearly forgotten, passed down from her mother's lips when she too had bent over the same tasks. The house felt snug in that moment, the way it sometimes did when there was work, but no immediate worry, when the children were close by and the fire didn't need tending quite so often. Haruto sat nearby, mending the frayed strap of a water pail. His fingers were clumsy still, but patient, and Yusuke watched him through the window, wondering not for the first time what kind of man his son would become if only the world allowed him the space to choose. That evening, as dusk slipped in and cast long shadows along the floorboards, they all gathered again around the fire. The meal was modest but warm, the kind that filled the belly, even if it didn't linger on the tongue. Kaori passed Yusuke an extra piece of radish, and Haruto shared the last bit of tofu with his sister, who had eaten quickly and looked around, as though still hungry. No one said much, but they didn't need to. It was in the way they moved, in the way they served one another, that the closeness showed, and when the wind rattled the bamboo once more outside, no one flinched. They simply leaned in a little closer, letting the warmth hold them just a little longer against the coming dark. Sleep arrived late that night, and even when it did, it was light and easily disturbed. Yusuke found himself waking several times, each time unsure of what exactly had stirred him. The wind had quieted, and the usual creaks of the old house were no more pronounced than usual. Yet his senses remained alert, his body half tensed in that way it did when something unseen loomed close, not as threat, but as change. He eventually sat up, careful not to wake Kaori, and stepped outside, wrapping his robe tighter around him. The night air was sharp and clear, and the moon floated high and unbothered, casting soft silver light over the fields, like a sheet pulled gently over sleeping children. He stood quietly near the gate, the wooden post cool beneath his fingers, and stared out toward the road that wound beyond the hills. It was empty, of course, just a dark ribbon vanishing into shadow. But he thought about the countless feet that had passed along it. Messengers, merchants, tax officials, wanderers, and always, it seemed, the ones who came with the lightest steps carried the heaviest burdens for others to bear. Yusuke breathed deeply, the air filling his lungs with a scent of soil and soot, and something faintly sweet from Kaori's dried herbs stored under the eaves. He didn't stay long. The chill crept quickly through the robe's fabric, and besides, there was no point in standing vigil over a road that would carry what it chose, regardless of who waited. He slipped back inside, the house welcoming him with its quiet warmth, and lay down once more beside his wife, her breathing steady in the dark. Haruto stirred slightly but did not wake, his hand flopping gently across the mat like a leaf, settling back into place. Yusuke closed his eyes and let himself be pulled slowly into sleep. He didn't dream of tax scrolls or missing grain, or officials with polite cruelty etched into their smiles. He dreamed instead of the rice fields in full bloom, of laughter carried on summer winds, of his children running between rows of green, free for just a moment from the weight of history. It was enough to bring rest, even if only for a few hours. Morning crept in gently, like fingers parting the edge of a paper screen. Light pooled softly on the floor, casting delicate patterns across the woven mats, and the house stirred in quiet response. Kaori was the first to rise, her movements slow and careful as she wrapped herself and moved to the hearth. She lit the coals without fuss, nudging the fire back to life with practiced hands, and soon the soft scent of steaming rice began to fill the space. Yusuke opened his eyes to the low crackle of flame and the faint sound of water heating, his body still heavy but his mind already stepping into the day. He sat up without a word and joined her, taking up a straw broom and beginning to sweep the entryway. These early hours were always the calmest, when nothing yet demanded explanation. Haruto emerged soon after, his eyes squinting against the morning light, his hair tousled in a way that reminded Kaori of when he was much younger. He grumbled softly, reaching for the basin of water to splash his face, and then sat beside his sister, who had already begun playing with a small bundle of fabric she had fashioned into a doll. Breakfast passed in slow bites and few words, a meal more about routine than hunger, but no less meaningful for it. Outside, the fields glistened faintly with dew, and birds called lazily from the trees that bordered the path to the stream. It was just another morning, unremarkable in most ways. But within that ordinariness there was a certain grace. Each small gesture, each quiet exchange of glances and tools and warmth was a stitch in something that held them together, stronger than worry and more enduring than any decree that might come from distant voices. They did not speak of burdens, they simply carried them, side by side. Later that evening, as the light mellowed into a honey-colored hush and the shadows reached long and soft across the earth, Yusuke stood at the edge of the paddies, watching the breeze ripple across the water like a hand brushing gently over silk. The seedlings stood tall now, their roots sunk deep into the muddy ground that had been turned and tended with care. He let his fingers trail through the tops of the shoots, feeling the slight resistance of their growth, and closed his eyes for a brief moment, breathing in the familiar mixture of water, soil, and the faint sweetness of late spring. Behind him, the house glowed with the last golden light of the day, and the soft murmur of Kaori's voice drifted out through the open window, speaking low to their daughter as she arranged small wooden bowls for the evening meal. Haruto had gone to the shed to check the new bundles of straw they'd set aside for drying. His footsteps, once loud and hurried, now moved with quiet purpose, and Yusuke felt that small ache of pride again, the kind that sat deep in the chest and rose, not with words, but with silence. He looked out toward the path that led into the hills, where the road curved out of sight, and though his mind wandered briefly to the uncertainty that still hung in the air like mist, it no longer pressed down with the same weight. Perhaps they would be called to give again, perhaps more than they could spare, but for now the ground was planted, the house was warm, and his family was near. That night they ate together in the soft lamplight, the room quiet but full. Kaori passed the rice, their daughter giggled at something Haruto had whispered, and Yusuke leaned back slightly, allowing the warmth of it all to settle into him. When the fire dimmed and the children's breathing grew slow and steady, he and Kaori lay side by side, their hands resting near each other in the space between them. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, and above, the stars blinked silently across the night sky, unchanged by the world below. In that stillness, with nothing left to give but everything already held, they slept, wrapped in the kind of peace that only comes from having endured.